Practical wisdom, wisdom for living day to day. It is what true faith looks like not only on Sunday, James chapter 2, but on Monday through Saturday. And if you don't have the Monday through Saturday down, as we'll see at the end of our study this morning, then having the Sunday down doesn't make any difference. And so Christianity is a 24-hour a day, 7-day a week, 52 weeks a year for as long as we live. James is teaching us about that practical wisdom, and what he says is Christianity is more than just talking the talk, it is walking the walk. And we have a responsibility to do that. It is, as both Terry and Ben noted last night, it is Proverbs in the New Testament. I would say that James had leaned heavily on the book of Proverbs, but I will say the Spirit leaned heavily on the book of Proverbs because James wrote what James wrote by inspiration of the Holy Spirit. It is not only Proverbs in the New Testament, but it is James's Sermon on the Mount. As both of those men noted last night, a lot of the Sermon on the Mount, in fact, the very spirit of the Sermon on the Mount is in the book of James. It describes how to truly love God and to love your neighbor. And what it really says to us is if you claim to love God, then you will love your neighbor. James's goal is that you may be perfect and entire, lacking in nothing. That word perfect crops up in the book of Proverbs, as we'll see. It crops up in the teaching of Jesus in his sermon, and certainly it is talked about, I think it's 7 times in the book of James. We find that word perfect, and as Terry pointed out last night, it has to do not with some kind of a sinless perfection, but a going into maturity. That is what James says to these people who seem to be, in what he writes to them, seem to be totally spiritually immature. And he says, you need to go on in your walk through this life to maturity. Well, if James borrows heavily or is influenced at least by Proverbs and by the Sermon on the Mount, then there are things that are in the book of Proverbs that we're going to see quite a bit of in the book of James, and speech is certainly that. F. LaGard Smith, in his narrated Bible, 62 verses he puts in the category of speech. 62 verses in the book of Proverbs. That's quite a bit of material. 2 or 3 chapters worth of material in 31 chapters has to do with our speech. And he didn't put every verse in there. Some of it he reserved for other topics. And so what that says is 62 kind of touches the hem of the garment in the book of Proverbs on the importance of speech in our day-to-day living. But he does give a number of warnings about the fool's talk, and we don't have time to go through all of these, but if Solomon says if you want a good beating in life, then just talk like a fool. A snare to the soul is what the fool's talk is, and he'll come to ruin. He talks about reckless words and harsh words and a deceitful tongue and gossip and things of that nature that are going to bring harm not only to the speaker but to those who listen as well. And chapter 16 and verse 27 I point out specifically because James talks about the tongue being a fire, and he says that the scoundrel's speech is like a scorching fire. And James would certainly agree with that. We'll see that this morning. But there are rewards for wise talk as well. The lips of the wise protect them. The value of wise talk. You know, we put a lot of value on the things of this earth, and the book of Proverbs puts a lot of value on attitudes and actions and those kinds of things including speech. It nourishes, it exalts a city, its fruit is good things. There is joy and instruction and healing and the calming of wrath and those kinds of things. He says it's like a tree of life to a person to have this control of the language. And so he says the power of the tongue in chapter 8, verses 20 through 21. The tongue has the power of life and death. So what Solomon wants us to know is there is a lot of power in this instrument that we have in our mouth, as it is controlled by the thoughts, by the heart. And so, since speech is so much a part of the book of Proverbs, it's not hard to understand why speech is also a principal thing on Jesus' mind as he presents his sermons, and especially his Sermon on the Mount. He says in Matthew 5 and verse 9, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God." Chapter 5 and verse 22, the danger of cursing one's brother. Chapter 5 and verse 25, you need to agree with your adversary quickly. Chapter 5 verses 34 through 37, the idea of not swearing, the idea of letting being honest in the things. You don't play games with the truth. He says, let your no be no and your yes, yes. Mean what you say so that you don't have to go through all of these mental and verbal gymnastics in order to either say what you mean or to get somebody to accept what you are saying, or to try to pull something fast over someone. Just if you say yes, it's because you mean yes. If you say no, it's because you mean no. And in chapter 5 and verse 44, one of the most difficult things that we have to do, and that is to guard our tongue among those who would be our enemies, who would curse us. He says, bless those who curse you. In Luke 6 and verse 45, a good man brings forth good, an evil man brings evil. Out of the abundance of the heart, he says, the mouth speaks. And again, we see with Jesus the word perfect. If you want to be perfect, and God wants you to be perfect, he says, if you want to be perfect, then you're going to guard your words as you guard the rest of your life. And so, being that James is so much like Proverbs and so much like the Sermon on the Mount, it is not surprising then that James says a lot about our speech. In chapter 1 and verse 19, let every man be swift to hear, slow to speak, and slow to wrath. Verse 26, if anyone among you thinks, remember that word, if you think you are religious, he says, if anyone among you thinks he is religious and does not bridle his tongue, but deceives his own heart, this one's religion is useless. Chapter 4 and verse 11, do not speak evil of one another, brethren. Chapter 5 and verse 9, do not grumble against one another, brethren, unless you be condemned. Chapter 5 and verse 12, do not swear, but let your yes be yes and your no, no, lest you fall into judgment. Where did James learn that? He learned it from Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. And so, in chapter 3, then, we find, I think, the quintessential passage on the tongue. I've never heard anybody speak about our speech that didn't at some point go to James chapter 3, if not making that the central focus of the things that they have to say. And so that is my task this morning, to talk about what James says in chapter 3 about the wisdom of our speech. And he begins in a very puzzling way. Terry talked last night about how James begins rather abruptly and kind of surprisingly, and count it all joy when you go through these various trials. That's kind of arresting, isn't it? The idea of joy in trials. And it seems like with every one of these starting verses in these chapters, chapter 4, where do wars and fights come from among you? Well, they come from inside you, from your desires. It's kind of arresting to us. Chapter 5, come now, you rich, weep and howl for your miseries that are coming upon you. That's arresting, isn't it? The rich people need to be cautious. The rich people need to weep. The rich people need to howl in their misery that is coming upon them. That's stark language and surprising language to us. Well, I tell you, chapter 3 and verse 1 is a surprising statement to me. He says, let not many of you become teachers. The Greek word there, and I'm kind of like Terry, I know twice as much Greek as Terry. I know 2 Greeks in McKinney, and they run a little Greek restaurant. The word "I am told" is a word that has to do, and if you look this word up in your Greek concordance or whatever, you'll see that the vast majority of the time, if not all the time, it has to do with the public proclamation of the gospel. He's not talking about you talking to your friend over a coffee table or in the privacy of your living room and helping them to understand. He's talking about the public proclaimer of the gospel of Jesus Christ. And what he says is not many folks need to be that. Now that kind of flies in the face of everything that we stand for, doesn't it? Our churches typically operate on the Numbers chapter 11 verse 29 principle, oh, that all the Lord's people were prophets. Here's Joshua, and he hears that there are 2 guys that are not part of the group, and they're out there prophesying, and he comes to Moses and he says, man, we got to do something about this. And Moses says, I just wish everybody was doing it. Well, that's kind of what we do. We beg, we bribe, we cajole, we guilt people into teaching. I don't know how it is with a congregation of 400 folks, whether you just have them lined up at the door waiting to come in and teach. Where I'm at, and we insist on this quarterly system, which means we need to have at least 4 teachers for every quarter in each class. And we got about, 140 folks there, Jeremy? And man, you talk about having to beg people to do it. That's the way we operate. Well, James says that's not a good idea. We need to be more discerning in our teaching programs and who we allow to publicly teach. And the question of that is why? And what does he say why that is in the last part of that verse? Knowing that we shall receive a stricter judgment. Now, I don't know about you, Terry and Ricky, and Jacob and Jeremy and you, Tim. But man, that makes me sit up and take notice. We're going to receive a stricter judgment. God is going to judge us more strictly as we stand up and teach than he is going to judge the person in the pew that is sitting and is listening. There's great reward in teaching. Why would anybody want to be a teacher, especially in what James says in this passage? Why would you want to do that? Well, because there's great reward in it. In Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 11, he lists teachers in that group that God has placed in the church. Why, verse 12? So that we can equip the saints for the work of ministry, for the edifying of the body of Christ. What a wonderful responsibility that. Tim, isn't that a wonderful thing to be able to do? to help people grow, to build people up in their faith. Such a wonderful thing. In Nehemiah chapter 8 and verse 8, what a 5th century BC Bible class looked like. Here is Ezra on the first day of the year, and he is reading the law of God to these people. And there are 13 men plus Levites who are out in the crowd. And what are they doing? They are speaking to the people. They are further instructing them. And I love the way it says it. They were giving them the sense of what was being read to them, explaining to them, instructing them in the law of God. That's a Bible class, isn't it? You read the passage and then you say, this is what this means. This is the sense of this passage. That's what these men were doing. What a wonderful thing that is. Wouldn't you have loved to be there in Nehemiah 8 and verse 8 on that new year, right after they had finished the reconstruction of the wall? They had taken this thing that was in rubble and they built it up, and now it is time for a people who are in spiritual rubble to be built up. And here are these men participating in this. What a wonderful opportunity that was. In Proverbs 11 and verse 25, he says, he who waters will also be watered himself. That's true in the physical sense, that the person who waters is going to benefit from the watering. I'll tell you, it's true in a spiritual sense as well. You people who teach Bible classes, who gets the most out of your quarter of Bible class? Teacher does. And that's one of the great things about preaching and teaching, is that I get more out of what I do than anybody else does. And then Matthew 28, verses 19 through 20, that great passage in Matthew on the Great Commission. Go and make disciples of all the nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all things whatsoever I have commanded you. Now that was spoken to the apostles, but I tell you, everyone who goes out and influences someone else in their obedience to the gospel of Jesus Christ, whether it is in initial obedience to the gospel or it is standing in front of an audience and helping them to further mature, what a great spiritual legacy we are following in that. We're getting to do a part of what God and Jesus Christ sent those men out to do in the first century. But there's also great danger in teaching. In 1 Timothy 1, the Apostle Paul says he has left Timothy in Ephesus in order to straighten some things out. And one of the things that needed to be straightened out is they had men that were teaching there who really ought not to have been teaching. They were not qualified to teach. They didn't know what they needed to teach. And Paul says you're going to have to confront these fellows because he says in verse 7, they desire to be teachers of the law. Problem is they neither understand what they say, nor the things which they affirm. He says you have a number of folks here who are really wanting to teach. They want that influence of teaching. They want to be part of that. He said the problem is their knowledge doesn't match their desire. Have a lot of desire, but they don't have very much knowledge at all. And as a result of that, they are teaching fables and endless genealogies, idle talk, verse 6, chapter 6, verses 20 and 21, the same kind of thing, idle words that they are teaching. They don't know God's Word, and yet they want to be teachers of God's Word. And so rather than teaching and preaching what is genuine truth, they are teaching that which is not truth, and it is to the detriment of souls. Souls are being destroyed in Ephesus because people want to be teachers, but they are not qualified to be teachers. Matthew chapter 23 and verse 15, Jesus to the scribes and the Pharisees, one of the woes that he presents upon them is that they go and they travel land and sea in order to find one proselyte, one disciple for Judaism. And he says, when you have found him, you make him twice the son of the devil that you are. Destroying souls, taking people even further away from God in the things that they say. And so there's great danger in teaching. And I don't, we look at what James says there, let not many of you be teachers. And I don't think he's saying there that you don't need to aspire to that. Paul, don't aspire to be a teacher. He's not saying that. What he's saying is, if you want to be a teacher, you need to understand it is serious, serious business. What you are doing has the power to give life spiritually, also has the power to destroy spiritually. And here's the point of that. If you're not willing to treat it as the most serious thing you will ever do, don't even begin to do it. And I've seen people who've gone into Bible classes before, and they are unprepared, and it becomes well, what do y'all want to talk about this morning? And then off the top of their head, they start talking about it, and it turns into a big mess. That's what James says. Be very selective in what you desire to do, teaching, and who you allow to teach you. And then he talks in verses 2 through 12 about the power of the tongue. Speech is important to control. And so we say to ourselves, okay, let's just control it. if it's kind of, Nancy, I'll go back, not quite as far as you did, well, maybe as far, Nancy Reagan on how to deal with drugs. Just do it, Just say no. That's how you control it. Well, easier said than done, isn't it? And James, if we have this attitude of just do it, James says, hold up, because it is not that easy. In verse 2, for we all stumble in many things. If anyone does not stumble in word, he is a perfect man. There's your word perfect again, Terry. He's a perfect man, able to bridle the whole body. What James wants us to know is that the ability to control the tongue is at the top of the scale of spiritual perfection, spiritual maturity. In verses 7 and 8, he talks about the fact that we have the ability, well, let's read it, for every kind of beast and bird, of reptile and creature of the sea is tamed and has been tamed by mankind, but no man can tame the tongue. It is an unruly evil full of deadly poison. He says we've tamed all of these beasts. We learned how to do that. But we can't control the tongue. The tongue is the greatest beast that we will ever face. And so the question arises then, how do you tame a beast? And the answer to that is by being more determined than it is. I was talking to Boyd before we got here to make sure I had the story right. But when we were both young, my dad would buy us animals. We lived We lived in city limits, but we had like an acre of land, and in the back of it was pasture. And so he would buy these animals. And he got to buying horses. And he always, if he could buy a horse for $10, that's the horse that we got. He bought a Welch pony and its foal one time. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Welch ponies. They are between a Shetland and a real pony mixed with a bulldog. These things are stubborn, and every time, we had that thing for several years, every time we wanted to ride that horse, that pony, my dad had to go out and break it again. I don't care if it was the next day, he had to get on it and he had to break it again. Well, the day came when we wanted to ride the horse. And so Dad bridles it, saddles it, gets on it, and it bucks him off. And it seems like I remember, Boyd didn't mention it, seems like I remember he hit the fence, and one of his fingers was going in a place it ought not to go, and he had a cut on his wrist. And so he goes back in the garage, and he gets barbed wire, and he wraps the bit in barbed wire. And he gets back on that horse, and it's like it was pudding that he had put in his mouth. That horse bucked him off again. And my mother is there going, Richard, no! And my sisters were crying. I think Boyd and I were going, ride him, cowboy. And so he looks at me and he says, go in the garage, get a 2x4. He had a 2x4 about that long, and he gets on that horse, and the beating commences. He is beating that horse to death. But guess who won? Richard King won. When he was finished, that horse was rideable. We could get on it and ride it. That's the tongue. Sometimes you got to take barbed wire and a 2x4 to it in order to tame it, and he says then, you're still not going to tame that tongue. Why? Because it's powerful. Verses 3 and 4. Indeed, we put bits in horses' mouths that they may obey us, and we turn their whole body. Look also at ships. Although they are so large and are driven by fierce winds, they are turned by a very small rudder wherever the pilot desires. And so 2 illustrations here. Very kind of proverbial, isn't it? That sounds like something that Solomon might have used to illustrate the tongue in the book of Proverbs. A bit in a horse's mouth turns the horse, a small rudder turns the ship. There is power in the tongue. There's power for good in the tongue. And there's power for bad. And that power for bad is equal to the power. As good as the benefits are to a tongue that is rightly used, so are the possibilities of destruction and the depth of the destruction that can come from a tongue that is wrongly used. And I'll tell you what is it about. The tongue is just a tool. Everything depends on who has the reins and who is at the helm. In Job chapter 4 and verse 2, here as Job has poured his heart out in chapter 3 about what misery he is in. And Eliphaz listens to this, and I think he gets the wrong idea. Job is, I am in misery. And what Eliphaz hears in that is, I don't deserve this. This is not something that, I am a righteous man and I am being wronged in this. And Eliphaz listens to this chapter that Job speaks. And in verse 2, he asks the question, but who can withhold himself from speaking? I was reading a quote the other day. It is at that time when you most think you need to speak that most likely you need to not speak. And the bad advice begins there from Eliphaz thinking, I just have to do this. Who can withhold himself from speaking? I tell you, Paul answers that question in Galatians 2 and verse 20 when he says, it is no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me. Who's holding the reins of your bit? Who is helming the rudder of your ship? Who has the reins and who is at the helm when you speak to your wife? When you speak to your kids or young people, when you speak to your parents, when you speak to your schoolmates or workmates, who's at the helm at the ballpark, on the golf course, at the hunting camp? Who's holding the reins on your tongue when you talk to your brethren? In verses 5 through 6, even so the tongue is a little member and boasts great things. See how great a forest a little fire kindles. And the tongue is a fire, a world of iniquity. The tongue is so set among our members that it defiles the whole body and sets on fire the course of nature. It is set on fire by hell. Well, that's pretty powerful, isn't it? The tongue is a spark that can kindle a great forest fire. Every year we read of forest fires in the West, especially in California, consuming thousands and thousands of acres of land. And the question is, who threw the cigarette butt out the window? What a great fire just a small spark can make. It is unbelievably destructive, the power of an uncontrolled tongue. It has the power to kill a reputation. It has the power to kill someone's innocence. It has the power to kill someone's confidence. It has the power to kill joy. It has the power to kill a soul. And the thing about it is, all it takes is one single solitary word. And you can destroy a person for life. If you don't believe it, read the stories about words that are said or words that are typed on the internet and the potential that has to destroy a life. Words are powerful. Stupid, loser, ugly, worthless. Those are bells you cannot unring. And before we would ever say anything like that, we need to realize the forest that we are setting on fire in the spark that we speak. Verses 9 through 12. I want to go to Isaiah 6 first. How do you fight a fire? Well, you fight it sometimes with fire, don't you? In Isaiah chapter 6, here is Isaiah, and he is envisioning this. How much time do I have? Okay. He is envisioning this great scene where God is on his throne and there are seraphim, all these six-winged creatures. And let's go over there. Isaiah chapter 6. And here's the vision. God on his throne, seraphim standing on each side of him. Verse 3, one cried to another and said, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of His glory, and the posts of the door were shaken by the voice of Him who cried out, and the house was filled with smoke. Kind of felt that way last night with Terry and Ben. Imagine, I was thinking last night, how do I follow that? Imagine following a seraphim, praising God around His throne. And I'll tell you how Isaiah handles it. He is devastated by his own unworthiness. Woe is me, for I am undone, because I am a man of unclean lips, and I dwell in the midst of people of unclean. Isn't that interesting? He is talking about the life that they are living, the moral lives that they are living, and how does he describe it? Unclean lips. He sees himself unworthy. And you can understand why that would be after all that he has seen and all that he has heard. Verse 6, then one of the seraphim flew to me, having in his hand a live coal which he had taken with the tongs from the altar, and he touched my mouth with it and said, Behold, this has touched your lips, your iniquity is taken away, and your sin purged. What was and was not on Isaiah's mind as he heard those seraphim speak? It wasn't, man, I need to up my talent game. I need to go to a class on public speaking so I can be, more talented in the things that I say, because, man, that seraphim, he brought the ceiling down. Talent wasn't what was on his mind. His worthiness to engage in what the seraphim were doing was what was on his mind. I don't care how much talent you have. If morally your lips are unclean, you are unworthy to teach the people of God. Here's what ought not to be. James 3, beginning at verse 9. With it, that is, with the tongue, we bless our God and Father, and with it we curse men who have been made in the similitude of God. Out of the same mouth proceed blessing and cursing. My brethren, these things ought not to be so. Does a spring send forth fresh water and bitter from the same opening? Can a fig tree, my brethren, bear olives, or a grapevine bear figs? Thus no spring yields both salt water and fresh. What he says here is that the believer's tongue is to be totally dedicated to pronouncing blessings. Luke 6, verse 28, bless those who curse you and pray for those who spitefully use you. Romans 12 and verse 14, bless those who persecute you. Bless and do not curse. And I love 1 Peter 3 and verse 9, not returning evil for evil or reviling for reviling, but on the contrary, blessing, knowing what? That you were called to this. Called to what? Called to bless. When Jesus called us, He called every single bit of us. When He called us, He called our tongues as well. And if that is true, if our lives and our tongues are be totally devoted to blessing, then curse is against everything a Christian is designed to be. And he says, It is as unnatural to the Christian as fresh and bitter water from the same fountain. You ever seen that happen? No. Why? Because it's unnatural. It's either fresh or it's bitter. Can't be both. It's against nature. Olives from a fig tree, unnatural. Figs from a grapevine, unnatural. Jesus said some things about that, didn't he? In Matthew chapter 7. Fresh and salt water from the same spring. He says that's unnatural. Well, so is the tongue that blesses God on Sunday morning and goes home and curses family or friend or workmate or enemy on Monday through Saturday. The fact of the matter is that you can't do it because God won't stand for it. In verses 13 through 18, who is wise and understanding among you? Let him show by good conduct that his works are done in the meekness of wisdom. But if you have bitter envy and self-seeking in your hearts, do not boast and lie against the truth. This wisdom does not descend from above, but is earthly, sensual, demonic. For where envy and self-seeking exist, confusion and every evil thing is there. But the wisdom that is from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, willing to yield, full of mercy and good fruits, without partiality and without hypocrisy. Now the fruit of righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace. One of several calls in the book of James. It's time to get real. You need to get real about your Christianity. You need to get real about your calling. You need to get real about your discipleship in Jesus Christ. He says talk is cheap. Anyone can bless God, and talk and brag about the fact that man, they go to church on Sunday morning and they just sing their heart out. But that's cheap. And we can fool ourselves very easily. Laodicea in Revelation 3 and verse 17, they had fooled themselves. They weren't real. They weren't what they thought that they were. You say, what do they say? We're rich. We're wealthy. We're in need of nothing. He says, and you do not know. You're basically bankrupt and in misery spiritually. A church that had fooled itself, and I think James is writing here to churches and individuals who have fooled themselves into thinking because they talk it, that means that they are. True wisdom, he says, is recognized by its fruit. If your life is characterized by bitter envy, self-seeking, confusion, wars, then your life is a lie. If your church is that way, then your church is living a lie. And it is ruled, he said, by the demonic world, not by God, not by Jesus Christ, but by the world. But he says if you have purity and peace and gentleness and mercy and good, you have a life, you have a church ruled by Christ. And therefore it is ruled by true wisdom. And I close with this. If you have to tell everyone how wise you are, you most likely are not. Thank you.